Howdy everyone. We've got another week and a half or so of testing and tuning done, including some major changes to healing. So we're going to break down how each of the tanks has been affected. Not going to waste a ton of time getting into it, but I do have to say a big thanks for all the support the channel has gotten in our first month or so. We're hoping to hit that 1,000 subscriber mark by January, so if you like the channel and can support us by hitting that button, we'd really appreciate it. Thanks a lot. The big system change this week came in the form of an adjustment to player health and enemy damage. Players now have 40% more stamina, and enemies now deal 40% more damage. In explaining the need for the change, Blizzard said, "When damage mitigation abilities and healing are too strong relative to player health, the only way to threaten players is to make enemy damage very high and spiky. If healers can very quickly top off their teammates and mana isn't a limiting factor, enemies have to be tuned to have the capacity to do burst damage that kills players before healers can react." So, how does this change affect tanks? Well, tanks have three major types of self-healing. The first type of heal we'll talk about is the least common. It's percentage health-based healing. An example of this would be Frenzied Rejuvenation for Druids, which heals them for a percentage of their health, or Impending Victory for Warriors, which does the same for them. This type of healing is unaffected by the changing health pools. Second, you have heals that are based on damage taken. Example of these are things like Death Knight's Death Strike or Demon Hunter's Consume Souls. These heal more when you take more damage. Since damage taken has increased along with player health, these types of healings are also essentially unaffected. Damage reductions from block, armor, parry, and dodge all also generally fall into this category, although some of the math gets a little bit more complicated there. The last type of heal is those that are based on attack power, or spell power. Examples of these types of healing are things like Word of Glory, which heals you for a specific amount of health, or Leech, which heals you for a percentage of your damage done. The value of these kinds of healing is significantly reduced with these changes. Also in this group is pretty much all healing from healers, so if you're relying on your healers to keep you alive, they just got a lot weaker as well. Coming into the weekend, Druids received some significant changes to their tuning. I went into a lot of detail about the exact changes in the new pathing through the tree in a video last week, so if you want more specific details, that link is on the screen. The TLDR version is that it's now not really ideal to take all the Moonfire talents and Ursoc's Fury together. Ursoc's Fury took another hit this week since it's an attack power based healing, and that means that we'll likely end up dropping Ursoc's altogether in Mythic Plus. You also lost 10% damage on Moonfire. In exchange, you end up with significantly more rage generation, therefore reducing the cooldown of Incarn, and increased Maul and Mangle damage that will help with the single target damage. This weekend, we got our first look at how the spec held up in Raid and Mythic Plus. I played the spec for a while on Mythic Primalist Council. That's a 4-target stacked cleave fight. And in that situation, where I was able to get an extra cast of Incarn in as opposed to last time we tested it, the damage was higher. This is the specific type of situation where Ursoc's Guidance is strong, where it lets you get extra uses of Incarn. In general, throughout Mythic Plus though, where pull sizes and uptime were a little less consistent, overall damage seemed about the same or slightly lower than a week ago, despite Incarn having a slightly higher overall uptime. We haven't generally talked a whole lot about bugs on the channel, kind of trusting in Blizzard to fix most of them before the game actually goes live. But when talking about the current state of Druid survivability, I have to at least mention 2 Berserk bugs that haven't been fixed, despite being in the game since Alpha. Berserk Unchecked Aggression is not reducing the cost of Maul during Incarn, which can affect a big DR with Tooth and Claw. And Berserk Persistence is not reducing the cooldown of Frenzied Rejuvenation by 100% during Incarn. If this were working properly, and you always had Frenzied Rejuve throughout Incarn, as well as 2 charges when you left Incarn, and you had Incarn for 30 seconds out of every 90 seconds or so, then Bear survivability would be in a 100% fine place. As is, without these nodes working properly, I found myself out of buttons and calling for help from my healer a lot more this week than I had previously with Ursoc's Fury. Overall, I don't think these changes are a buff to the spec, but I also don't see them as a significant nerf either. Druid will be reasonably tanky, but it is still behind the other specs in damage.
Vengeance Demon Hunter only saw one update from Blizzard in the last week. Sigil of Silence cooldown was reduced from 90 seconds down to 60. This is a nice buff to their Mythic Plus utility for a class that didn't need much help at all. They also weren't overly affected by the 40% health and damage change. Their main source of healing is the collection of their soul fragments, which scales with damage taken and loses no power at all. The second most important healing that they have is AP based in the form of Leech and Frailty. The Soul Rendering talent gives a flat 10% leech all the time, and an additional 10% leech during meta. And all of this healing that you're seeing is going to be 40% weaker. That being said, Demon Hunters aren't really affected that much because they were already overhealing quite a bit. So much so that the Soulmonger talent, which converts overhealing into a shield, was actually a viable option. Now less so, as you're going to spend less time being topped off and actually spend your time healing back up into full in between taking damage. Talents like Illidari Knowledge, which increases your magic resistance by a flat percentage, and Will of the Illidari, which increases your stamina by a percentage, are going to feel like stronger talents to take. Demon Spikes doesn't lose any power from these nerfs, and is still a very strong base mitigation, with 100% uptime possible with extended spikes and Feed the Demon. I don't think Vengeance has surpassed Warrior on the tier list, but if you're still on the fence about what to main in this expansion, I highly recommend Demon Hunter. It's straightforward to play in both AoE and single target situations. Demon Spikes is easy to maintain and accounts for a large portion of your damage reduction, and the rest of your defenses, Meta, Fiery Brand, and Feldev, are simple to use and for the most part are on low cooldowns and always available. Other than that, it plays closer to a DPS class than any of the other tanks. Just remember, the more damage you do, the more leech you do, the more you heal, so don't forget to keep blasting.
There isn't much to not like about the state of Blood Death Knight right now. Essentially all of their important healing comes from sources that scale with damage taken. Deathstrike and Blood Shield both fall into this category, and can scale pretty much as high as you need them to in whatever content you're doing, as long as you aren't getting 100 to 0'd. Even Tombstone is % health based, so it also wasn't affected by the changes to healing this week. This means that in a week where several tanks got at least a little bit weaker, Blood Death Knight maintained their same level of strength, and in comparison to those other tanks, got slightly stronger. Even before this week's changes, we had Blood Death Knight just behind Prot Warrior and Vengeance Demon Hunter. That gap seems even smaller this week. If you're looking to play a tank spec with a rotation more akin to a DPS, i.e. it's a rotation instead of just a priority list, and you're ready to spend the time perfecting the intricacies of Blood Death Knight, you're going to be playing a really strong tank. And I know that this is a really short update, but Death Knight just hasn't seen many changes over the last month or so, and that's a really good thing.
There's no way to get around saying it, but Paladin was unfortunately the big loser of this healing change. The short story sounds like this. All their healing and their shielding is AP based, and their base mitigation is similar to Warriors with block and parry, but just a worse version. Word of Glory and the amplifiers that go with it, Light of the Titans and Hand of the Protector, all nerfed. Bulwark of Order, which is the shielding you get from your Avenger Shield, and even Golden Path, which I didn't run in some of my later builds, is all AP based and fully nerfed. I even had a Fury Warrior out heal me on one of the boss fights in a plus 12 temple. Sure, it's just a plus 12, and if I had focused my power on healing instead of damage, I'm sure I could have pulled away, but I know for sure that the Fury Warrior was not focused on healing at all. As far as tier list goes, this actually drops Paladin down for me to where Guardian Druid is. I just have to sell out talent points, it feels like, for more defense, just because I don't feel sturdy. You can do this with any of the tank specs, but when you want to try and rank them against each other, it's all about what one tank can do better than the other ones, or what one tank can do that the others can't do. And right now, Paladin really only has a couple of those niches with Blessing of Protection and Blessing of Spell Warding, as well as the extra kicks that they get from Avenger Shield. I know I keep talking about the feel of it, but after you play the class for half an expansion, then they change it in the beta and you get used to how that feels for a couple months, and now you're just 40% weaker. Sure, it's not exactly 40% because it's only the healing actually that's reduced, but yeah, you just feel 40% weaker. For me, this spec is tough to talk about because I had it in my head for sure that I was going to be maining a prot Paladin going into Dragonflight. And unfortunately, with these continuous nerfs that it's receiving, I'm just not so sure about that anymore. I will leave this by saying that I hope that the spec does receive some tuning, a little bit of buffs to get it back competitive with the other tanks. And all it really needs is just to gain what it lost from this nerf. A little bit extra healing from Word of Glory so that it feels like it's on par with where it should be, and it actually does top you off. I get that it's not lay on hands, but Paladins need to feel like they can heal themselves, like they can heal their party members. That's how they're useful as tanks, and this nerf absolutely takes that away from them.
Warrior is another class that seemed to take the percentage health changes in stride. The vast majority of Warrior's healing comes from Ignore Pain. The amount of actual shielding done by Ignore Pain is percentage damage based, As long as you've got enough shielding stored up in your Ignore Pain, it blocks 55% of the damage you take up to its cap. The maximum amount of shielding you can store is percentage health based, so that is also essentially unchanged. Now, the amount of shielding you store in Ignore Pain is attack power based. That means you will store relatively less shielding than before each time you press Ignore Pain. This sounds on paper like it would be a big deal, but in practice, Warrior Rage generation in AoE is so high that before the changes we were already dumping excess rage into Ignore Pain just to prevent overcapping. Even after the change, in AoE situations, I never once felt like I didn't have enough rage to keep Ignore Pain up and use Revenge when I wanted to. My number of casts of Ignore Pain and Revenge were almost identical this week compared to last week in Mythic Plus. This may become more of an issue in single target, where Warrior Rage generation isn't quite as high. This week, both Mythic raid bosses were multi-target, so there wasn't a great time other than Mythic Plus bosses to test the single target effects. Looking at my logs compared to last week wasn't particularly conclusive. My feeling was that it was a little harder to keep up Ignore Pain and the bonus from the tier set, but I would want a lot more time on single target bosses before I conclusively said that was the case. Either way, I never felt like I was in danger of dying. If anything, my single target damage might have been slightly lower than last week, but overall, compared to how strongly affected some tanks were, this was basically a non-issue for Warrior.
Brewmaster is another one of the tank classes that hasn't seen any direct changes. In our last tier video, I called it a glass cannon. Did the healing nerf completely move Brewmasters into the trash can? Gift of the Ox, Expel Harm, and Celestial Fortune are all 40% weaker. All the extra healing you get from Grace of the Crane and Close to the Heart, all nerfed. Celestial Brew, which is a major defensive cooldown, is AP base, so it's just 40% weaker, right? I am here to report that no, Brewmaster Monk is not completely in the trash can. These nerfs did not kill the class at all. In fact, Stagger and Purifying Brew are now a relatively stronger part of the kit. More damage coming in means more Stagger and stronger Purifies. The 4-step bonus also increases your amount that you purify. Combine this with Gaiplin's Brews Healing, which is actually stronger now because this is based on the amount that's purified. Your healing nerf actually buffs the central part of the Monk's defensive kit. More Stagger being purified means that your improved Celestial Brew actually charges to 200% shield faster. Combine this with the Black Ox Brew talent, and while it's a pain to add more buttons to a class that already has way too many, it really comes in handy when you have a few seconds left on your next Purify, you just ate through your Celestial Brew shield, and you can drink that Ox Juice and know that you won't die just yet. Another heal available in the kit is Healing Elixir, and this is a percent HP based heal, so it doesn't see any of that nerf. And I wasn't using the talent much because it is kind of relatively weak, but if you find yourself needing just a little bit of extra self-healing and you're willing to sacrifice some of the damage points in order to take it, it's going to be worth it. One thing that I'm really enjoying and also stressing over is the ability in the spec tree to choose defense over offense. So you can drop Bone Dust Brew, you can drop Charred Passions, an Exploding Keg, and Weapons of Order. And yes, a couple of those have some defensive value to it, with Exploding Keg reducing all your melees for 3 seconds and Weapons of Order granting you extra mastery. But usually you press these buttons to do more damage and not to reduce your damage taken. You can pick up Blackout Combo, Walk with the Ox, and Anvil and Stave, and get lower brew cooldowns, which means more Purifies, more Celestial Brews, and more defense. Now some of this talk may be just me getting used to playing the spec a bit more, and that's why it feels tankier to me now than it did before this healing nerf. I can't really discern for myself. The more comfortable I get with the class, the more I understand when I'm in danger, when I can Purify and use a Celestial Brew and just expel harm and heal myself up. The playstyle is unforgiving and requires proactivity with your defensives, but the reward is going to be the best AoE damage in the game, and Monk continues to bring some of the best party utility out there.